I wonder if you've ever felt this too, that quiet ache that lives somewhere between the heart and the memory, that gentle tug that appears when the world feels too loud, too fast, too unfamiliar, and something inside you whispers, "It wasn't always like this." I feel it sometimes, no, many times, especially in the early mornings when the sky is pale and the air is still deciding whether it's cold or warm. Those are the hours when the past comes back to me, not as a story, but as a place, a real place, where life seemed so simple that even the silence felt safe. Imagine yourself stepping outside your front door sometime around 1954. The wood creaks softly under your feet, and there's that familiar scent of dew settling on freshly cut grass. A milk bottle waits by the porch, beads of condensation sliding lazily down its glass. The world hasn't fully awakened yet, and for a moment it feels like everything is holding its breath. The sunlight didn't rush. It arrived like a polite guest, slipping through curtains in golden ribbons, warming the kitchen tiles 1 inch at a time. As a child, I would sit on the front steps with my elbows on my knees, listening to the world wake up. The rustle of newspapers being delivered, the neighbor's screen door tapping softly in the breeze, the faint clatter of someone winding up a mechanical clock inside their house. A dog barking just once, as if to say, "Yes, we're here, another day has begun." The roughness of the wooden banister under my fingers, the faint smell of breakfast drifting through open windows, coffee percolating, bacon sizzling slowly in a pan, not rushed, never rushed. Even the aromas of the morning felt like they had all the time in the world. And yet what stays with me most isn't the objects or the sounds. It's the peace. A kind of peace that didn't need to be earned or protected. It simply existed, woven into the fabric of ordinary life. People spoke softly, streets breathed calmly, time stretched in wide, generous arcs. There was a spiritual stillness in the air, one I didn't understand then, but I feel deeply now. It was a world where you could hear your own thoughts, and they didn't compete with 1,000 invisible voices. We moved slower, not because we wanted to, but because life itself invited us to. There was space to breathe, to listen, to notice the small miracles, the steam rising from a cup, the metallic click of a toaster, the echo of laughter drifting from the neighbor's backyard. I remember walking barefoot on the warm pavement, the sun heating my skin while a soft breeze brushed past my ears. Every sensation felt honest, grounded, real. Even as a child, I knew, deep in my bones, that these moments mattered, even if I couldn't explain why. Maybe that's what nostalgia truly is, not longing for things, but for the feeling of being held by the world. And perhaps, if you let yourself drift with me, you'll feel it too. That old softness, that quiet safety, that sense that the world, for a brief time, moved at the perfect speed for the human soul. I remember stepping back into the house after those quiet mornings, feeling the coolness of the kitchen floor beneath my bare feet. The linoleum had a texture unlike anything today, smooth but with tiny raised patterns that pressed lightly into my skin. The kind of detail only becomes clearer with time, as if memory itself sharpens what the years try to fade. I can still see the soft pastel colors, mint green cabinets, pale yellow curtains, a gentle blue tablecloth that fluttered whenever a breeze slipped through the open window. Everything looked lived in, touched, familiar. There were small scratches on the wooden chairs, a slight dent on the side of the refrigerator door, a crack in the ceramic sugar jar. But nothing felt broken. These imperfections were simply stories, quietly etched into objects that stayed with us for decades. Toast, popping up with a soft metallic click. My mother humming a tune she must have heard on the radio the night before, something slow and hopeful, a melody that made the morning feel even gentler. Voices in the 1950s had a softness, a calm weight, as though people were aware their words carried into the stillness of the home. I would watch her move around the kitchen with an ease that felt almost ritualistic, opening drawers, wiping the counter, stirring the pan with a quiet patience that only comes from a life lived at a steady rhythm. The small, everyday movements that shaped our world more than the big events. Back then, simply preparing breakfast felt like an act of love, a way of saying, we're here, we're together. The day is beginning, and everything is all right. Outside, sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting soft, swaying patterns on the walls. They moved like gentle waves, slow and mesmerizing. Even as a child, I found myself staring at them, feeling an inexplicable sense of peace, as if the house itself breathed in time with the morning. And perhaps that was the true essence of the 1950s. The world felt like it breathed with you, not ahead of you, not against you, just with you. He carried the scent of the outside air on his clothes, fresh grass, a hint of gasoline from mowing the lawn, a trace of the cool morning breeze. He would ruffle my hair, sit down, and unfold the newspaper with that unmistakable rustling sound that filled the room like soft applause. Maybe the world was simpler, or maybe we simply weren't drowning in information the way we are today. My father would read a headline, nod thoughtfully, and take a slow sip of his coffee. He savored each moment, each breath, as if time itself invited him to pause. I often wonder, did everyone feel it back then? That natural slowness, that gentle pace that allowed you to notice life's smallest details. A quiet reminder that life didn't need to be grand, to be meaningful. The sacred lived in the ordinary. I can hear the low hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the screen door swinging shut, the soft laughter of my parents as they teased each other about something unimportant yet unforgettable. That safety isn't about walls or locks. It's about the presence of people who move through the world with kindness in their hands and calm in their voices. Not the objects, not the fashion, not even the nostalgia itself, but the feeling of being held by a life that didn't rush, didn't demand, didn't overwhelm. I can still feel what it was like to step outside after breakfast, the screen door tapping gently behind me as it closed. The air had already begun to warm, but it was a gentle warmth, the kind that seeped slowly into your skin and made you feel alive without ever overwhelming you. The neighborhood carried its own symphony, soft, predictable, comforting, a far-off lawnmower humming, a radio playing through someone's open window, the distant laughter of kids who were already outside, running barefoot on sidewalks warmed by the rising sun. Little cracks, filled with tufts of grass, chalk drawings faded from the day before, the faint scent of last night's rain trapped in the tiny dips and grooves. When I inhaled deeply, I could smell the faint mixture of earth and concrete, a scent that belonged only to summer mornings in the 1950s. I remember walking down the street, each house carrying the same familiar blueprint, white fences, neatly trimmed hedges, flower beds, tended with quiet devotion, but each one had something unique, something personal. A porch swing that creaked with age, a metal mailbox shaped like a small barn, a wind chime that sang whenever the breeze felt playful. These little things told stories about the families who lived inside, stories you understood without words. The scent of tomatoes and fresh soil clung to her like a second skin. A few houses down, Mr. Collins would be polishing his car. Always the same ritual, always on the same day, moving in slow, careful circles, as though the car was something sacred. And in a way, it was. Everything was, because everything had value that wasn't tied to speed or convenience. Not out of obligation, but because time felt generous enough to allow it. Wooden shelves lined with neatly arranged cans, glass jars filled with candies that glistened like tiny gems, a faint scent of old paper and peppermint lingering in the air. The floors creaked under the weight of history, as though every customer who'd ever walked through had left a quiet trace behind. The shopkeeper always greeted me by name, his voice low and warm, carrying the cadence of someone who had seen 1,000 mornings just like this one. He'd wrap my small purchases in brown paper, folding it with careful hands, as if he were preparing a gift rather than a grocery item. Even the simplest transactions felt personal, human, meaningful, not just in memory, but in spirit, as if the world itself acknowledged that these small gestures were the true architecture of life. A sense that life was perfectly aligned, not because it was flawless, but because it was real, slow, tangible. Every sound, every smell, every texture was a reminder that I wasn't rushing toward something. I was living in something. How the laughter of neighborhood kids, the rustle of leaves overhead, the steady pulse of a small-town street can become treasures we carry for a lifetime. It was the pace of life itself, the gentle, predictable rhythm of a world that moved softly enough for the heart to keep up. There was something almost sacred about the afternoons back then, a kind of hush that settled over the neighborhood once the sun climbed high and the world warmed into a slow, golden lull. I remember how the air would grow thick with the smell of freshly watered gardens, how the cicadas would begin their steady chorus from the trees, filling the silence with a rhythm that felt timeless, ancient, almost meditative. The blades tickled my arms, leaving faint impressions on my skin. There was a softness to the air, a warmth that wrapped around me like a familiar blanket. I could hear the distant clatter of someone hanging laundry on a clothesline, the wooden clothespins snapping shut, the fabric giggling lightly in the breeze. Even that sound feels like an artifact now, something lost to time. Every shadow, every breeze, every rustling leaf felt alive, carrying some quiet message only the heart could interpret. But to us, it was enough, more than enough. The world didn't need to be big to feel magical. All it needed was imagination, and in the 1950s we had plenty of that. We weren't distracted. Our minds were free to wander, to create entire worlds out of shadows and sunbeams. I can still recall the feeling of gripping the swing's chains, cool at first, then warming beneath my palms as I began to move. The squeak of the metal echoed in the quiet afternoon, rhythmic and steady, like a lullaby disguised as motion. I would pump my legs, feeling the wind push against my face, and for those brief moments I felt like I was flying, not soaring above the world, but rising perfectly in tune with it. Every swing forward felt like a promise, every swing back felt like a memory, and in the distance, you could always hear the soft murmur of adults talking on porches, conversations that drifted through the warm air like gentle smoke. They spoke about simple things, the weather, the garden, the neighbor's new car, the church picnic next Sunday. Their voices had a grounding quality, steady and reassuring, like anchors quietly keeping the world in place. The condensation would drip onto my hands, cold against the heat of the day. Even that sensation felt like part of something larger, a small detail woven into the fabric of a peaceful afternoon. There were no screens pulling our eyes in 1,000 directions, no endless noise filling the spaces where thoughts should be. The afternoons belonged to us, to our senses, our imagination, our quiet rituals. We weren't running toward the next thing, we were simply being. And maybe that's the feeling so many of us miss, the rare and precious experience of inhabiting the present moment fully, without distraction, without urgency, without the constant hum of a world demanding more. Sometimes the truest beauty is found in the spaces between words, in the shadows beneath a tree, in the gentle sway of a swing left moving by the wind. Our minds wandered freely, our days unfolded in a quiet rhythm that made everything, absolutely everything, feel safe. As the afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, there was a moment, a very particular moment, that I came to cherish more than anything. It happened almost every day, always in the same soft, unhurried way. The sunlight would begin to tilt, stretching long shadows across the yards, painting everything in a warm, honey-colored glow. The world seemed to settle into itself, as if preparing for a gentle exhale. Birds hopped lazily along fences, their wings rustling in the sweet golden hush. It was a kind of magic the modern world rarely slows down enough to notice. You could hear screen doors opening with that familiar springy squeal, the soft thud of wooden steps as people stepped outside. My father would usually join the neighbors, leaning on the railing or settling into a worn-out folding chair that creaked under his weight. The conversations that followed weren't rushed or forced. They unfolded naturally, like stories that knew they had all the time in the world. There was something comforting in that sameness, something grounding. Their words floated around me like gentle ripples, discussions about the garden, the church choir, the weather's strange mood that week. Every now and then a burst of laughter would roll down the street, soft and sincere, like a warm light breaking through the evening air. Sometimes I would wander to the edge of the yard and drag my hand across the rough bark of the old oak tree. Its texture was familiar, uneven, grounding. The roots twisted under the soil like ancient veins, anchoring not just the tree, but somehow the entire neighborhood. The leaves above me rustled with the softest whisper, as if they too were remembering something. Kids would appear seemingly out of nowhere, their laughter lighting up the dusk as they ran barefoot toward the sound. I'd feel the warm pavement under my feet as I joined them, the world around us pulsing with simple joy. The freezer door released a soft cloud of frost every time he opened it, and the chill brushed against my face like a tiny miracle. I remember pressing a few warm coins into his palm and choosing a treat with a wrapper so colorful it felt like holding a piece of summer itself. Walking back home with melting ice cream dripping onto my fingers, I'd feel the evening settle deeper into the world. The sky would turn soft shades of peach and lavender, the kind of colors that make you pause without knowing why. Fireflies would begin their slow, magical dance across the lawns, flickering like little souls, drifting through the gathering twilight. I didn't have the words for it then, but I felt connected to the earth beneath me, to the sky overhead, to the gentle pulse of the neighborhood settling into night. That the softness of those evenings was something permanent, something unbreakable. But time, as it always does, had other plans. And yet, even now, decades later, I can close my eyes and return to it. Every sound, every scent, every flicker of firefly light preserved like a cherished photograph inside my mind. Those evenings taught me what peace feels like, what slowness feels like, what it means to exist without rushing toward the next hour. And sometimes, when the present becomes too loud, too sharp, too heavy, I return to those memories, not to escape the world, but to remember how to breathe within it. Nightfall in the 1950s had a way of arriving gently, almost politely, as if asking permission before settling in. I remember how the sky would deepen slowly, turning from soft lavender to a velvety blue that felt endless. The first porch lights flicked on, glowing with that warm amber tint that doesn't exist anymore, lights that didn't try to overpower the darkness, only soften it. You could hear the low murmur of families finishing dinner, the clink of silverware being placed in sinks, the soft laughter of children still reluctant to come inside. Everything blended into a kind of peaceful hum, a lullaby woven into the fabric of the night. Lamps cast gentle pools of light across the living room, illuminating the floral patterns of the sofa, the polished surface of the wooden coffee table, the framed photographs that lined the mantel. Sepia-toned faces belonging to relatives who felt both distant and intimately familiar. The room smelled faintly of supper, roast chicken, potatoes, a hint of fresh bread, mixed with the subtle aroma of furniture polish my mother used every Saturday. He'd lean back with a contented sigh, the newspaper folded neatly beside him, and tune the radio to one of his favorite evening programs. The radio had a warmth to it, a physical warmth you could feel if you placed your hand on its wooden surface. The voices that drifted through it were rich and steady, telling stories or delivering gentle commentary that filled the room without demanding attention. Sometimes I traced them with my finger, following their paths as if navigating a secret map. The calm of the room seeped into me, filling me with a feeling I didn't know how to describe then. Something like safety mixed with belonging, wrapped in a quiet awareness that the world was big, but tonight my place in it was clear. My mother would sit nearby, her knitting needles clicking softly, each movement practiced and peaceful. The sound was hypnotic, the steady rhythm of metal against metal, the slight rustle of yarn sliding between her fingers. Every few minutes she'd glance toward me with that warm, knowing smile, the kind that said everything without a single word. The kind of smile that stays with you long after the person who gave it has gone. It was then that I felt the deep quiet of the 1950s most intensely, a quiet that had weight, presence, meaning. To the faint creak of the house settling into the coolness of night, to the distant hum of a passing car, its engine fading into the darkness like a sigh disappearing into memory. I didn't understand it then, but now I see it clearly. It was the sound of a world that still honored stillness, a world where time didn't ambush you, it accompanied you. The wooden boards beneath my feet were cool, smooth from years of footsteps. I would lean on the railing and breathe in the crisp night air, the scent of damp earth, fresh leaves, lingering wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Fireflies still flickered in the yard, their little lights blinking like tiny lanterns guiding unseen travelers. The stars shone brighter then, unchallenged by neon signs or glowing screens. They felt closer somehow, as if the sky itself bowed lower over our small street, offering its quiet blessing on the houses below. And in those moments, something inside me felt incredibly still, incredibly alive. That was the kind of night the 1950s gave us, slow, gentle, meaningful. A night where nothing extraordinary needed to happen for the world to feel whole. A night that cradled you like a memory you'd spend the rest of your life trying to return to. There was a particular quiet that settled over the world once everyone had gone to bed, a kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but full of secrets, full of memories, full of the unspoken tenderness of a day well lived. I remember lying in my small bedroom, listening to that silence as if it were its own kind of music. My room had a single window that looked out onto the backyard. At night, the moonlight would spill across the wooden floor in pale silver streaks. The curtains, thin and patterned with tiny blue flowers, swayed gently whenever a breeze slipped through the screen. And on those nights when the wind carried the scent of pine and fresh soil, I felt as though the whole world were breathing with me. My bed creaked softly when I shifted, the cotton sheets cool against my skin. There was something comforting about the roughness of those old blankets, something grounding. They were heavy, dependable, like a quiet promise that no matter how big the world was outside, here I was safe. Sometimes, before sleep took me, I would listen for the sounds of my parents moving through the house, my mother washing the last dish, or closing a window she forgot earlier. My father locking the front door, clearing his throat softly, humming a melody he didn't realize anyone could hear. Those little sounds drifted down the hallway and wrapped around me like the final threads of the day. And when everything finally stilled, when the house settled into its night and even the crickets softened their song, my mind often wandered into places that felt impossibly large. Lying there in the dark, staring at the faint glow of the moon on my ceiling, I wondered about the future, not with fear but with curiosity. The kind of curiosity that grows only in children who feel unhurried, unburdened, safe enough to dream without boundaries. Just me and the silence and the slow, steady breath of the darkened house around me. Now it feels like a message from a world that no longer exists. I would picture it cutting through the darkness, its windows glowing, carrying people I would never meet to places I couldn't imagine. That sound. To this day, it still stirs something in me. Something ancient, something lonely and beautiful at the same time. And when sleep finally found me, it wasn't the restless kind that grapples with the weight of the world. It was soft, deep, unbroken. The kind of sleep you get only when life is simple, when your mind hasn't been stretched thin by noise, by speed, by the relentless demands of a world that never learned to slow down. Sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night today, surrounded by the quiet hum of appliances, the distant roar of traffic, the faint glow of digital clocks, I think about those 1950s nights. I think about how different the darkness felt back then, softer, more intimate, more alive. The world slept with you, not around you. And in those moments I long, deeply, achingly, for just one more night in that small bedroom. One more night with the moon painting silver across my floor. One more night hearing my parents move through the house. One more night where silence wasn't something to fill, but something to feel. Evenings in the 1950s didn't belong to noise. They belonged to togetherness. The furniture was simple. A sofa that had seen better days, a couple of wooden chairs with cushions slightly faded by the sun, and a rug that carried the soft footsteps of children who ran across it 1,000 times. Before screens glowed in every corner of life, the center of the living room was something almost poetic. The radio, the laughter of sitcom hosts, the richness of a drama narrated by voices that felt familiar, the live broadcasts that made the outside world feel close yet harmless. Mothers would mend clothes or fold laundry. Fathers would lean back with a sigh that somehow released the entire weight of the day. Sometimes it was something far simpler, a board game missing half its pieces, a deck of cards frayed at the edges, or the quiet magic of a puzzle spread across the coffee table. And through all of it, something unspoken happened. In those living rooms, between the crackle of the radio and the low hum of conversation, families built something invisible but unbreakable. Some people today wonder why the 1950s still feel like a warm memory, even to those who never lived through them. I remember the nights most vividly, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were complete. In the 1950s, nighttime carried a kind of softness that doesn't exist anymore. It didn't rush you. It didn't demand anything from you. It simply wrapped itself around the houses like a quiet, protective blanket. Back then, when the sun set, life didn't continue at full speed the way it does today. It slowed, and then it settled. I can still see the dim glow of the lamps, yellowish, warm, almost sleepy, casting gentle shadows on the wallpaper patterned with tiny flowers. Those lights made everything feel safe, as though the darkness outside couldn't touch us. The air itself seemed calmer. You could hear the soft creak of wooden floors cooling after a long summer day, the subtle ticking of a wall clock marking each second with patient certainty, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, and somewhere far away, a train whistle drifting through the evening like a reminder that the world was larger than our little street, yet peaceful all the same. There was a ritual to getting ready for bed, a rhythm that everyone seemed to follow without being told. Parents would check that the doors were locked, not out of fear, but out of habit, a small gesture of care that felt like an invisible hand guarding the house. Children would wash their faces with cool water, the porcelain sink echoing faintly with splashes. The scent of mint toothpaste mingled with the faint aroma of laundry dried in the open air. And the bedrooms. They held stories of their own. Mine had a window that faced the backyard, where the moonlight would fall in long silver streaks across the wooden floorboards. I used to lie in bed watching the curtains sway with the breeze, thinning the distance between dreams and the real world. Back then, even the darkness felt friendly. It wasn't filled with screens, notifications, or the restless buzzing of a world that never sleeps. It was a darkness that invited rest, a darkness that understood the human need for silence. Sometimes, before bedtime, my parents would sit by my door, speaking to each other in soft whispers about bills or neighbors or plans for the weekend. Their voices blended with the quiet of the night in a way that made me feel anchored, protected, like nothing bad could ever truly reach us. And as I closed my eyes, I would hear the gentle heartbeat of the house, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the floor gently settling, the final footsteps of the day fading into stillness. The nights of the 1950s weren't glamorous. They weren't grand. They didn't sparkle with artificial light or noise. But they carried something far more precious, a sense of ending, a natural closing of the chapter, a moment when the world pressed pause and allowed every soul to surrender, to breathe, to rest without guilt, to drift into sleep, knowing that tomorrow would arrive just as gently. Today it's hard to find that kind of quiet, that kind of softness, that kind of peace. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still feel those nights. The cool sheets, the dim glow of the hallway light, the comforting murmur of family nearby. And in those moments, just for a breath, I return to a time when the world felt smaller, kinder, and endlessly safe. There was a place in the 1950s that almost every family treated like a sacred ritual, even without realizing it. A place where time slowed down, where conversations softened, where the world seemed to pause just long enough for us to breathe. The front porch. I remember stepping outside after dinner, the screen door creaking behind me, that familiar, comforting sound that somehow felt like the house whispering, "I'll be right here when you come back." The air always carried a different texture in the evening, cooler, smoother, as if the day had exhaled and finally relaxed. Sometimes it smelled like freshly cut grass, other times like distant rain that hadn't fallen yet, but most often it smelled like summer itself, warm, gentle, innocent. My parents would sit on the wooden steps or in those metal chairs that clicked softly whenever someone shifted their weight. I can still hear that metallic echo. It's funny how such a simple sound can become a lifelong memory. Neighbors would wave from their own porches, calling out little phrases that meant very little and yet meant everything. Evening. Beautiful night, isn't it? Kids asleep already? Those small exchanges were threads that stitched the entire street together. We didn't need gatherings, parties, or schedules. The porch was the gathering. You just had to show up. Fireflies would twinkle across the yard like tiny floating lanterns, and I would chase them barefoot, feeling the cool earth press against my skin. Sometimes the simplicity of childhood sits in moments exactly like that. Moments when the whole world exists between your toes and the grass beneath them. From the porch, the street looked different at night. Not empty, but peaceful. Cars passed only occasionally, their headlights stretching across the pavement like long, glowing ribbons. And every once in a while, someone's radio would drift through the air from down the block, playing a soft melody that mingled with the chirping of crickets and the gentle rustle of leaves. Even silence had a sound back then, a deep, warm hush that made you feel rooted, as if the world outside your home wasn't rushing forward, wasn't demanding anything, wasn't spinning too fast to hold on to. Sometimes my father would talk about his day, not in a dramatic or heavy way, but simply, honestly. He spoke slowly, in that unhurried tone men seemed to have back then, as though every sentence deserved the space to breathe. My mother would listen with her chin resting on her hand, nodding, occasionally smiling, offering those quiet, knowing responses that told me love didn't always need big gestures. Sometimes it lived in simple presence. I learned more about life from that porch than from any classroom. That was where I first understood patience, because nothing about those evenings felt rushed. That was where I learned what it meant to truly listen, because people spoke with their hearts as much as with their voices. And that was where I first understood the passing of time, the way the sky darkened gradually, softly, without ever announcing itself. We didn't talk about the future. We didn't worry about whether the world was changing. We didn't check clocks or screens or messages. We simply sat. We simply existed. Together. And maybe that's why those porch evenings stayed with me, because they were moments when nothing needed to happen for everything to feel complete. Eventually, one by one, the porch lights along the street would blink on, warm golden halos glowing against the darkness, each one signaling that another family was ending their day in peace. I loved those lights. They made the neighborhood feel connected, as though every home were a star in a constellation we all belonged to. When the night finally grew cool, my parents would tell me it was time to go inside. And as I took one last look at the quiet street, I always felt the same quiet certainty, a feeling I can still recall even now. The world felt safe. Not because it was perfect, not because life was easy, but because people slowed down long enough to truly see each other. Sometimes I wonder if what we really miss isn't the decade, but the stillness, the shared silence, the gentle understanding that life didn't need to be big to be meaningful. And when I close my eyes, I can still hear the creak of that porch chair, the soft whisper of the evening breeze, the distant laughter of neighbors, and my parents' voices blending with the quiet night. That porch wasn't just part of my childhood. It was the place where the world felt whole. When I think back to the 1950s, one of the clearest memories that comes to me is the walk to school. Not the building itself, though I remember the creaking floors, the chalk dust that floated in sunlight like tiny snowflakes, and the smell of freshly sharpened pencils. But the journey we walked, rain, shine, or cold morning breeze, we walked. Not because anyone forced us to, but because walking was part of life, part of growing, part of understanding the world through our own small footsteps. The neighborhood looked different in the early hours. The grass sparkled with dew. Mailboxes stood like quiet sentinels at the edge of each yard, and the sky held that gentle, pale blue softness that only morning light can give. You could smell breakfast drifting from open windows, bacon sizzling, coffee brewing, toast popping from a metal toaster with that unmistakable warm scent that somehow felt like a promise. A new day was beginning. The school bell had a sound that carried across blocks, loud yet oddly comforting. It meant familiarity, routine, a place where faces rarely changed, where teachers stayed for decades, and where every child knew every other child by name. Inside, the classrooms were simple. Wooden desks carved with initials, maps hanging from rollers that snapped when pulled too quickly, a green chalkboard that never seemed completely clean, no matter how many times the erasers were clapped together outside the door. We learned reading, writing, arithmetic, the basics, the foundations, but we also learned something deeper, something life doesn't teach much anymore: patience. The pace was slower. Teachers spoke with intention, students waited their turn, and no one expected learning to happen instantly. There was a kind of grace in that slowness, as though knowledge wasn't something you captured, but something you invited in. Recess was a world of its own. The playground had no soft rubber flooring, no elaborate structures, no bright plastic. Just metal swings that groaned when pushed too high, a slide that burned your legs in July, a dusty field perfect for games of tag, and a jump rope that slapped the ground in rhythmic certainty. But none of that felt lacking. If anything, it felt real, raw, joyful, uncomplicated. We didn't need much to be happy. A stick became a sword, a few rocks became bases for baseball, a patch of dirt became a canvas for imagination. Every child knew that magic didn't come from the object, it came from the moment. And then there were the friendships, simple, loyal, unspoken. Friendships built not on messages or screens, but on shared secrets whispered behind the bike rack, on lunches traded beneath the shade of an oak tree, on quiet companionship during long walks home. Sometimes I wonder if those early bonds were stronger, because life itself wasn't pulling us in 1,000 directions. Because we had time. Time to sit together on the steps, time to laugh at something that wouldn't be funny to anyone else, time to simply be children. I remember the school cafeteria too, The stainless steel trays, the clatter of utensils, the smell of warm rolls, and that unmistakable combination of tomato soup and grilled cheese that somehow tasted like the essence of childhood. Even the milk cartons had a sense of innocence, their corners stubborn, requiring a bit of determination to open without spilling. And as much as we complained about early mornings, homework, and the strictness of certain teachers, there was a comfort in the structure of it all, a rhythm, a heartbeat. School wasn't just a place where we were taught lessons. It was a place where we grew, slowly, quietly, in ways that only make sense years later. When I look back now, I realize that those school days shaped who we became far more than we understood at the time. Not because of the grades or the textbooks, but because they taught us how to share, how to wait, how to listen, how to try again after failing, how to belong to something larger than ourselves. Those were days when childhood stretched wide before us, full of open fields, unhurried afternoons, and dreams that felt surprisingly possible. And sometimes, when life feels too fast, too loud, too crowded with obligations, I close my eyes and I can still hear the distant school bell of my youth, calling me back to a time when everything felt simpler, gentler, and endlessly safe. If there is one season that truly defined the 1950s, one stretch of time that felt almost suspended from reality, it was summer. Though summers didn't just happen. They unfolded slowly, warmly, deliberately, as if the world itself understood that childhood needed room to breathe. I remember waking up to sunlight that slipped through thin curtains, painting long golden stripes across my bedroom floor. The air carried the smell of warm grass and dust stirred by the first breeze of the morning. Nothing in the house felt hurried on summer days. Even the clock seemed to tick in a softer rhythm, less insistent, more forgiving. We didn't organize our summers around schedules or camps. We organized them around freedom. A simple breakfast, a bowl of cereal that softened too quickly in milk, but tasted perfect anyway. And then the day was ours. The neighborhood was our kingdom. Bikes were our horses. Sticks were our wands, our swords, our flags. And the streets were endless runways leading us toward possibility. I remember the heat of the handlebars on really hot days, and the coolness of the wind that whipped against my face as I raced down the block with a confidence that only a child could have. The confidence of a world that felt entirely safe. Some days we rode until our legs ached. Other days we wandered the woods behind the old baseball field, where the trees stood like ancient guardians and the sunlight filtered through the leaves in quiet, shimmering patterns. Those woods were our sanctuary. We built forts out of fallen branches, imagined secret societies, whispered stories whispered to us by older kids, stories we half believed, half invented. Even now, I can still smell the scent of pine sap, sticky on my fingers, and the earthy sweetness of the forest floor warming under the sun. And then there were the afternoons, those hot, drowsy hours when the world seemed to melt slightly, when the sound of cicadas rose to a steady hum, and every porch, yard, and open window carried the scent of lemonade and freshly watered gardens. We'd play until the heat slowed us down, and then we'd gather under the shade of the biggest tree on the block. Someone always had something to share, a slice of watermelon, a handful of cherries, popsicles bought with coins scavenged from the cushions of living room sofas. I can still feel the sticky sweetness of melted popsicle dripping down my wrist and the shock of cold when someone pushed a hose toward me, spraying water into the thick summer air, creating rainbows that shimmered briefly before disappearing. Even time behaved differently in those summers. There were no deadlines, no devices demanding attention, no constant flow of information filling every corner of our minds. Silence existed in places where silence belonged. Slowness wasn't a luxury, it was the natural order of things. And when the sun began to sink behind rooftops, the whole neighborhood shifted into something magical. Screen doors slammed open and shut. Kids were called home by parents whose voices echoed down the street, and lawns were lit by the soft glow of porch bulbs turning on one by one. We knew dinner was waiting, usually something simple, something made with care, something that tasted like home. After dinner came the best part of summer. That brief, perfect hour where the sun lingered just above the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across asphalt, still warm beneath our feet. We'd chase fireflies until we couldn't see our own hands clearly, until the darkness settled in a way that wasn't frightening, but comforting. A darkness that understood childhood and made space for dreaming. I often think about those summer nights. Not because of the games or the food or the endless adventures, but because of the feelings they stirred. Feelings of belonging, of safety, of being part of something quiet and good. Sometimes I wonder if the world was actually simpler, or if we were simply too young to notice anything else. But deep down, I think it was simpler. Because people slowed down. Because life was shared, because time didn't rush past us in a blur of obligations and noise. Those summers didn't just fill my childhood, they shaped my heart. And even now, decades later, when life becomes too fast or too loud, I close my eyes and I can still feel the warmth of those endless days, the glow of those forgiving nights, and the gentle certainty that, for a little while, the world stood still. Just long enough for us to grow. If the 1950s had a heartbeat, it pulsed strongest on Sunday mornings. Not because of anything grand or spectacular, but because of the stillness. A stillness so deep, so gentle, that even today I can feel it. E fecho os olhos e deixo minha memória caminhar de volta. Sundays began slowly. The house woke up differently. There was no rush, no scrambling for school books or lunch pails, no hurried footsteps echoing down the hallway. Instead, there was silence. A warm, peaceful silence that smelled like coffee brewing in the kitchen and biscuits baking in the oven, filling every room with a softness that made you want to move slowly, to breathe deeply, to exist fully in that moment. My mother hummed as she cooked, a quiet tune she never sang out loud, something between a lullaby and a prayer. The kind of melody that made you feel anchored even before you sat down at the table. My father read the newspaper in his favorite chair, the rustling of pages blending with the soft ticking of the living room clock. He always sat in the same spot, bathed in morning light that streamed through thin curtains and made the dust particles sparkle like tiny stars caught in mid-air. I didn't realize then how sacred that routine was, how consistency itself can be a kind of love, how the smallest rituals can give shape to an entire life. Sunday breakfast wasn't extravagant, but it felt like a feast. Pancakes soft and warm, fresh butter melting slowly on top, bacon crackling in a pan, and orange juice poured into glasses that always seemed colder on Sundays than any other day of the week. Families didn't just eat together, they lingered. They talked, not about obligations or worries, but about small things. The weather, the neighbors, something funny someone said at school, stories repeated for the 100th time, yet still somehow comforting. After breakfast, the whole neighborhood seemed to slip into a quiet reverence, not silence, but a kind of shared calm. Lawnmowers rested, radios played softly, cars stayed in driveways unless someone absolutely needed to go somewhere. Time stretched out before us like an open road with no destination in sight. Some Sundays, we went to church, walking together in clothes that felt slightly stiff and shoes that squeaked against polished floors. I remember the smell of wooden pews, the gentle flicker of candles, the murmur of prayers that rose into the air like a soft, collective sigh. But even when we didn't go, there was something spiritual about those mornings, a sense that life itself was giving us permission to pause, to breathe, to simply be. The afternoons belonged to the backyard. My father would sit on a folding lawn chair, legs crossed, eyes half closed, as he listened to the steady hum of distant cicadas. My mother tended to her flower beds, her hands moving with a grace that made every gesture feel intentional. Sometimes she'd pause, wipe her brow with the back of her wrist, and smile at me in that quiet way mothers do, as if she knew those moments would one day become the memories I held on to most. There were no chores that couldn't wait, no phone calls interrupting the air, no screens vying for our attention. The day unfolded gently, like the turning of a well-loved page. And then there were the evenings. Oh, those Sunday evenings. They carried a melancholy all their own, a soft, tender sadness mixed with comfort, because even though Monday waited just beyond the horizon, there was still beauty in the closing of a peaceful day. We often sat together in the living room, the lamps glowing warm and golden, casting long shadows on the walls. Sometimes my mother would sew while my father listened to the radio, his expression thoughtful, his posture relaxed in a way I rarely saw during the week. I would lie on the carpet, feeling its rough texture against my cheek, watching dust sparkle in the glow of the lamp, listening to the soft rise and fall of the radio announcer's voice, as if he were reading stories meant only for us. Those evenings taught me something that took years to fully understand. Peace isn't something you chase. It's something you allow, something you make space for, something that finds you only when you slow down enough to let it in. When the day finally ended and the house settled into its nighttime hush, I always felt wrapped in a quiet certainty. A certainty that the world wasn't rushing, that life wasn't slipping through my fingers, that everything was exactly as it should be. Sometimes I long for those Sundays, not for the routines themselves, but for the gentleness they carried, for the way they taught us that meaning isn't hidden in grand events, but in the softness of shared moments that unfold quietly, without announcement, without urgency. Those Sundays didn't just shape my childhood, they shaped my soul. If fathers were often seen as the steady anchors of the 1950s, mothers were the gentle, tireless heartbeat that kept everything moving. In an era before shortcuts, before conveniences, before the world became loud and rushed, their days were long, rhythmic, and filled with a kind of quiet heroism that no newspaper ever reported, yet every home depended on. You could track the rhythm of a 1950s household by the soft footsteps of the woman who lived within it. Before the sun had fully risen, she was already awake, moving through the kitchen with a familiarity that felt like a warm embrace. The kettle would whistle softly, bread would toast beneath a glowing coil, and the air would fill with the comforting aroma of breakfast, prepared not out of obligation, but out of love, stitched deeply into every motion. Her hands were never still. They were hands that cooked, washed, folded, wiped, mended clothing, comforted tears, and steadied small shoulders that were still learning how to carry the world. She knew every creak of the house, every crack in the walls, every sound of her children's footsteps before the children themselves even knew they were awake. And yet, despite the relentless demands of her daily routine, there was a softness to her presence that made life feel safe. Children didn't just see their mothers, they absorbed them, their calmness, their patience, the way they hummed old songs while stirring a pot on the stove, as if music were a secret ingredient. In the afternoons, when sunlight spilled lazily across the living room, mothers often paused, even if for a moment, to look outside the window and watch the world move quietly beyond the picket fence. It wasn't dissatisfaction. It wasn't longing. It was reflection, the kind that comes from carrying so many small lives that your own becomes woven into theirs. Women in the 1950s rarely spoke of exhaustion, but it lived in the gentle slump of their shoulders once the house was finally still. It lived in the way they lingered at the kitchen table after everyone had gone to bed, their fingers wrapped around a cup of tea that had grown cold while their minds wandered through the day. Still, they loved deeply, sometimes fiercely, sometimes silently, but always with intention. And their children felt it. They felt it in the packed lunches carefully prepared each morning. They felt it in the perfectly folded shirts placed on their beds. They felt it in the way their scraped knees were cleaned with a softness that made pain feel temporary. They felt it in the bedtime stories told in a voice that carried more warmth than any blanket. These mothers were the true architects of memory, the builders of routine, the keepers of peace in a world that, even then, held anxieties waiting quietly beneath its surface. And when those children grew into adults, they remembered, not the chores, not the strict schedules, not the imperfections. They remembered the moments, small, invisible, irreplaceable. The way their mother tucked a strand of hair behind their ear before sending them off to school. The way she whispered, "It's going to be okay," even when she wasn't entirely sure herself. The way her presence made the house feel like home, no matter how small, worn, or simple that home might have been. Today, we speak of the 1950s as a time of innocence, of simpler days, of a world wrapped in softer light. But the truth is this: the simplicity didn't come from the decade. It came from the people, and especially from the women who gave everything they had so their families could feel safe, steady, and loved. The 1950s glow in our collective memory, because millions of mothers carried the light, and their light never truly went out. When I close my eyes, I can still walk those 1950s streets as clearly as if I were there yesterday. They weren't wide avenues designed for speed or efficiency. They were slow-moving, breathing spaces that connected people more than they connected cars. Sidewalks weren't just pathways. They were theaters of childhood imagination. Chalk drawings sprawled across concrete like miniature rainbows, hopscotch games marked out with precision, and tiny collections of leaves, pebbles, or acorns became treasures shared among friends with a seriousness only children possess. Even the houses told stories. Each porch, each window, each fence carried a memory of someone's care. Gardens bloomed in small bursts of color. Lawns were meticulously tended, and hedges were trimmed with the same patience that parents used to teach manners and respect. Neighbors didn't just live near each other, they existed with each other. Front doors were often left unlocked because trust wasn't an ideal, it was a practice. It was common for someone to borrow sugar or eggs without thinking twice, to return it the next day with a smile and a cup of freshly baked cookies. I remember summer evenings when the air was heavy with warmth and the hum of cicadas blended with laughter drifting from open windows. Somewhere down the block, a father called his son for supper while a mother coaxed her toddler to bed. The rhythm of life was audible, soft, predictable, comforting. And yet, despite the calm, the streets were alive with energy. Children raced bikes until tires squealed and spokes hummed in protest. Balls bounced on the asphalt, hopscotch chalk scuffed away under small feet, and the echoes of our games seemed to linger long after we went inside. Evenings brought a different kind of magic. Porch lights flickered on, casting halos on sidewalks and illuminating faces that had spent the day working, teaching, tending, or simply existing. People lingered, leaning against rails or sitting on steps, sharing stories of days past or plans for the next week. You didn't need a reason to talk. Conversation itself was the reason. Sometimes I would wander to the corner, watching the neighborhood fold into twilight. The lamplight reflected off car windows and the wet asphalt after a summer rain, and I would hear snippets of piano notes drifting from an open window, or the soft strum of a guitar somewhere far away. The world outside my home felt vast, yet intimately connected. Like every life on that street was part of a quiet, unspoken pact, to care, to notice, to exist fully. The streets of the 1950s also taught lessons without words: patience, respect, community. These were absorbed as naturally as the smell of cut grass or the sound of a train whistle in the distance. You didn't read about them in books. You felt them in the way adults moved, in the way children played, in the way time seemed slower, so that everything had a chance to sink in. There was safety too, a kind of safety that no longer exists in the same way, not because the world was without danger, but because the rhythm of life itself created a net, neighbors watching out for one another, doors unlocked, children allowed to roam freely with trust in every step. Every street held stories of guidance, small acts of care, and unnoticed kindnesses that together wove the invisible fabric of community. Even the passing years can't erase the scent of those streets. The combination of freshly mown lawns, the faint tang of summer rain, and the subtle perfume of blooms tucked into gardens carries me back instantly. I can still hear the soft creak of wooden fences, the squeak of bicycle tires, the laughter of friends chasing after each other as the sun sets slowly behind rooftops. And in that memory lies a profound truth. The 1950s weren't just an era of objects or fashion or technology. They were an era defined by connection, by the people who made every corner of their streets, every porch, every sidewalk, every garden, a part of life itself. That sense of life breathing quietly through the streets, of communities quietly holding each other together, is something I carry with me always. And even now, decades later, I feel it in the marrow of my memory. A reminder that the world once moved slower, but moved with intention, that ordinary days were full of subtle miracles, and that the heartbeat of life could be felt in the soft glow of a lamppost or the echo of children's laughter fading into dusk. And now, as I sit here decades later, I let my mind drift back to the final moments of those days, the soft evenings of the 1950s that carried a kind of magic that seems almost impossible to describe, but never impossible to remember. There is a calmness in memory, a stillness that feels like sunlight caught in amber, and I can feel the weight of it pressing gently against my chest, filling me with both longing and gratitude. I remember the way the sky looked just before night fell completely, how the horizon glowed in layers of orange, pink, and purple, stretching endlessly across rooftops and treetops, as if the world itself paused to take a slow, deep breath before surrendering to darkness. Inside, homes settled quietly into routine. Parents tidied up the day, children finished their homework or whispered secrets to one another, and even the smallest details, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the gentle creak of floorboards cooling after a long day, the distant bark of a dog, all carried a sense of completeness, of life being exactly as it should be. There was safety, not in the sense that nothing could go wrong, but in the sense that everything had meaning and every action mattered, even if only to those who lived within that moment. I think of the streets again, lined with lampposts that glowed like faint sentinels of memory. Neighbors called out across yards, children's laughter carried far on summer breezes, and every sound seemed deliberate, crafted by life itself to remind us that even in simplicity there is grandeur. The 1950s taught us the rhythm of life, not the frantic, hurried rhythm of modern days, but a slow, deliberate one, where mornings, afternoons, and evenings had purpose without ever needing to declare it. Every small act, every conversation, every glance shared between family or friends was a thread weaving the fabric of belonging. I think of mothers, tireless and steady, the quiet pillars of home, their hands always moving, their love present in every meal, every stitched hem, every whispered reassurance. I think of fathers, anchors of patience and guidance, and of the children who learned how to belong without being told, by watching life unfold in front of them and participating in its gentle cadence. And then there were the nights, when the world outside fell quiet, when the moon traced its silver path across the yard, and when it felt like even the darkness understood the sacredness of those moments. You could lie awake and hear the heartbeat of the house itself, the steady rhythm of life continuing, and feel a connection to something larger, a lineage of days and nights, of small acts that shaped a world and shaped the people who lived in it. Memory makes us realize what we once took for granted. The safety of streets, the warmth of porches, the depth of conversations on slow evenings, the scent of summer, the sound of chalk on asphalt, the invisible presence of care that guided every step. All of it now a kind of treasure that we carry quietly, hidden in the marrow of who we are. The 1950s were not perfect. They were not unbroken, nor free of hardship or sorrow, but there was a poetry to them, a sense that life itself was a gift to be held carefully, a melody that could be felt more than heard, a stillness in which the soul could rest, if only for a moment, before stepping forward into the unknown. And as I breathe in this memory, I feel a quiet, profound peace, because I know that no matter how fast the world spins, no matter how much is lost to time, those days, those streets, those evenings, those voices, those small acts of love live on within me. The 1950s were more than an era. They were a feeling, an understanding, a deep, enduring whisper that life, when lived slowly, fully, and with care, can be endlessly beautiful. And so I close my eyes, letting the memory wash over me one last time, feeling the glow of lamplights, the warmth of family, the soft hush of evening settling across a quiet street, and I smile, because even though the world has changed, those days remain alive in the heart, and in memory everything is still safe, still slow, and still full of wonder.